It is good to be back. And yes, I did see a lot of crocodiles, but none too close. But I highly recommend a trip to Kakadu if you ever get the chance. It was just amazing. Our Bible reading for today is from Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 20. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And Simon said, "Sure, are you on Insta or TikTok?" And Simon and his brother Andrew began to follow Jesus. I was thinking this week about the concept of following and how that's really changed quite a bit. It's actually pretty easy to do these days, isn't it? Like you just follow. And if you lose interest, or you don't really have the time, or if the person you're following turns out to have a different opinion or point of view than you, it's easy to just unfollow. But that's not exactly how it went down in... did I do that? That's not exactly how it went down in Mark's story. It actually went more like this. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in the boat mending their nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. So when Jesus asks the fishermen to follow him, they immediately do it. They leave their nets, they leave their livelihood, they leave their father, all behind to follow Jesus. And they just do it without hesitation. It's like they're all in. They don't even look back. And I wonder if you've ever felt in awe of their commitment to do that. When Jesus asks the fishermen, they don't even take time to think about it. They just boldly, heroically, selflessly leave their livelihoods, leave their family to obey the call of Jesus to follow. And if we just snipped this little piece out of Mark's story and just read it without regard to the rest of the story, then we might see them as examples to follow. I'm sure you've been pointed to this passage if you've grown up in the church as an example to follow. But you'll remember that several weeks ago we read the whole of Mark. We read it from beginning to end, because that's what you're supposed to do with stories, is read them from beginning to end. And now we know that it's just not that simple. We know that towards the end of the story, when an armed crowd showed up to arrest Jesus, these same heroic men who boldly left everything to follow him all fled and deserted him. I guess they did unfollow him round then. And what looked so heroic the first time you read through Mark is now a little bit tainted with cynicism, maybe. Now we're reading it for the second time because we know how the story ends. We know way up there they all fled and deserted him. When they got scared, when it looked like their lives were in danger, they ran away. So there's this theme of following Jesus, and it meanders all the way through Mark's story. And it seems like Mark wants us to think about what it means to follow Jesus. That's what a theme does. When you keep on coming across people following or not following, clearly Mark wants us to just kind of ponder what it means to follow Jesus. You see, not long after Jesus calls those 4 fishermen and they leave everything to follow him, Jesus calls Levi, He's a tax collector. He's sitting at his tax booth, and he immediately leaves his tax booth to follow Jesus. So in all three cases, Simon and his brother Andrew, James, John, and now Levi, people leave things. They leave their nets, they leave their father, they leave the tax booth in order to follow. And we get the impression from these passages that they left their lives behind to follow Jesus. But then we read that they went to Peter's mother-in-law's home to heal her because she was sick. And Levi might have left his tax booth behind, but he still had the finances to throw this elaborate dinner party for Jesus. We learn just a little bit after. He throws this elaborate party for Jesus, his disciples, and a bunch of other tax collectors who have also decided, we're told, to follow Jesus. So while they left their nets, they left their father, they left their livelihood behind, there was still something, it wasn't like they just sort of disappeared off into the distance. They still had these relationships happening. Not long after that, a man wants to follow Jesus, but Jesus won't let him. This man is demon-possessed, and Jesus casts out the demons. And the man is so grateful, he wants to leave his town and follow Jesus. But Jesus asks the man to stay in his town and tell everyone what the Lord has done for him. So there's this case where a man wants to follow and Jesus says no. Another bunch of people start following Jesus without even being asked to. In chapter 3, Mark tells us that a great crowd of people from Galilee followed him. And crowds from Judea, south of Galilee, came to him as well, as word began to spread that Jesus was healing people and casting out demons. Well, why wouldn't you follow someone who was healing people and casting out demons, especially if you were sick, I guess? In fact, the crowd, which has apparently now swelled to over 5,000 people, is so keen to be with Jesus, at one point, instead of following him, which, when you think about it, implicitly means Jesus goes in front and these other people go behind him, following him, a little bit like, a mother duck and her ducklings. So instead of following, they actually go ahead and they arrive at Jesus' destination before he even gets there. The logistics of this is hard to imagine if you read that passage, because of course it's, then he ends up feeding them, these 5,000 people. But you think about that, the logistics of it just doesn't quite work. Jesus and his disciples, they hop in a boat and they cut across the lake, and somehow a crowd of 5,000 people figure out where he's going, and they manage to run around the edge of the lake on foot from all these different villages and arrive before him. And it's just hard to, make that work logistically. And so I wonder, is it possible that Mark is trying to make a point here with this whole theme of following that he seems to weave through his narrative? If the crowds are arriving before Jesus gets there, are they really following him? Not long after that, Jesus calls the crowd to him to give some more information about what it means to follow. And it's at this hinge point in chapter 8. If you were here for the reading of Mark from beginning to end, that's when we had an interval, right on chapter 8. After Peter declares that he knows who Jesus is. Jesus is the Christ. He's a king. And the crowds have been following Jesus because he heals people, because they like to hear him teach, because he does all these amazing things. And now Jesus tells everyone who is following him that actually following him is not all beer and Skittles. He says that if anyone wants to become a follower, they have to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. There's a cost to following, and it's a pretty hefty one. Following him might lead to death, because you know where he's going. He's going to Jerusalem, and he is aware that death is waiting for him there. So if you follow him, it might mean losing your life. And they might want to think about that, those crowds of people and his disciples. A little later, a rich man comes to Jesus and asks, "What do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus tells the rich man to sell everything and then come and follow him. He has to leave his wealth behind. Remember how those first disciples left things behind in order to follow? That's what Jesus asks this wealthy man to do. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't leave his wealth behind, and so he goes away sad. In contrast, Jesus then comes across this poor beggar. He's a blind man named Bartimaeus, and he gets healed by Jesus, and we're told that he immediately follows Jesus on the way, or on the road, on the way to Jerusalem. And when he does that, he leaves his cloak behind, because he throws off his cloak, and he goes and gets healed and then follows. A few chapters later, someone else leaves their clothes behind. A crowd comes to arrest Jesus, and all those disciples who boldly declared that they would follow Jesus to the death, they all desert Jesus and run away. And then there's this curious verse. A young man was following Jesus, Mark says, wearing only a linen cloth. They tried to arrest him, but he ran off naked, leaving his linen cloth behind. Have you ever noticed that verse? Some people have, some people haven't. When Cameron and I were planning the performance of Mark, I said that we should ask Kevin to have a little cameo appearance and do a quick streak across the stage. Cameron didn't think that that was a good idea. And since he's the award-winning actor, I just deferred to his judgment, but I still think it would have added something. What a strange scene though, like, there's 2 verses in there, there's no detail, nobody knows who this guy is, just sort of appears out of nowhere, and then this just bizarre, like, he just runs off naked. There are no unimportant details if you're telling a story. And I kind of wonder if this young man might be an example of a disciple in reverse. It might be Mark himself. Some people have speculated that. But this young guy, instead of leaving everything to follow Jesus, like all those other people did, when things got tough, he left everything to escape from following Jesus. There are just too many stories about people following or not following, about coming after Jesus or running ahead of Jesus even though they're supposed to be following. Jesus inviting people to follow him, asking people not to follow but instead to stay. People declaring that they'll follow and then running away. There's so much of this following. It just has to be something that Mark wants us to ponder. Mark is exploring this idea of what does it mean to follow Jesus. Sometimes, with my biblical scholar hat on, I think I can see what Mark was trying to do in writing the story of Jesus as he did for his time and his place. I think that he was challenging his hearers, his readers, the very earliest Christians living in the 1st century Palestine under horrendously difficult circumstances. More about that next week. I think he wanted to challenge them to figure out what it meant for them to follow Jesus. I think that Mark's story might have helped those early Christians to think through on a really deep and personal level what it meant to follow. I've talked about how Mark's story is this 2-part story that hinges in chapter 8. In part 1, Mark portrays Jesus as Superman King. Remember him? Superman Jesus who strides around casting out demons here, there and everywhere. healing people with a word from his lips or a touch from his hands, stilling the wind and the waves, feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It might not be too difficult to follow Superman Jesus, the one who'll heal you, who'll cast out your demons, who'll calm your storms, who will assure you that you'll never go hungry as long as he's around. But remember that abrupt change of tone after chapter 8, halfway through the story? Suddenly Superman Jesus becomes suffering Jesus. The miracles drop away in the story, and they're replaced by predictions of his own death and suggestions that those who follow him just might suffer the same fate. Very relevant for Mark's first hearers. In part 2, Jesus teaches that true greatness lies in service and not in status. In part 2, the king that you're being asked to follow is getting spat on and mocked and beaten. And I think Mark is putting the question to his first hearers, is this the king that you're willing to follow? Are you willing to follow that Jesus? Those disciples who left their nets and followed him in part 1 all fled and deserted him in part 2. Mark's provoking his readers, his hearers, to consider, will you do the same? Or will you stick with Jesus no matter what the cost is? I think that that's what's happening when I'm wearing my Dr. Denise biblical scholar hat. But when I put my pastor hat on, I want to be really careful about suggesting how Mark's story might intersect with our lives, because I've got sermons ringing in my ears about what it means to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow Jesus. And some of those sermons were not helpful. I remember being really conflicted about how to reconcile the idea of denying yourself with the need for healthy personal boundaries. You know, like how do those two go together? Does denying yourself equal being a doormat for Jesus? If not, well, what does it mean? I've seen people end up either burnt out or full of resentment after a life of continually putting others' needs before their own. And it's not pretty. And I've also seen this ideal of self-denial become a sort of a noble self-sacrifice that feeds this kind of martyr complex. And that path is not psychologically healthy either. And for our quite queer congregation, I can imagine, or maybe I can't, how sermons or pastoral advice about how following Jesus means denying yourself and taking up your cross has caused profound harm. You know, it just has. And so I can't and I won't tell you what it means for you to follow Jesus. Nobody can. That's something that you have to figure out for yourself. But I can tell you this. Mark has made a really big impact on my life and on the way that I follow Jesus. It's shaping, it has shaped, and it's still shaping who I am. It challenges the way that I see the world, and it helps me figure out how to walk through the world. Mark's story raises a lot of questions for me about what it means to follow Jesus, and I haven't worked out the answers to all of those questions. They're live questions for me. Maybe they are for you too. I'm not sure, actually, if I'll ever work them out. But sometimes I think that maybe that's the point. That Mark's story hasn't given me a divinely inspired bullet point list of answers or clear instructions on how to live life. Instead, what Mark's story has done is it's kind of got under my skin, and it niggles at me when I reflect on situations that I'm faced with. And it helps me to see things in a different light. Because that's what stories do. They niggle you. And I wonder how Mark's invitation to you to follow Jesus is niggling away at you too.